All right, well, I want to begin with this quote, and that is, good arguments need good arguers. Good arguments need good arguers. Now, as Rebecca mentioned, having recently come back from Scotland, I would probably add a third part to that quote, which would be, right, good arguments need good accents as well. I wish I had it. I wish I could say I came back from Scotland with an accent that was authentic. But it's not. It's just the one I've been doing because my dad is from Scotland. So, but anyways, good arguments need good arguers. Why is that? Why do good arguments need good arguers? Hopefully we're all trying to figure it out. Yes? Okay, because there's a lot of nonverbal communication. And how we communicate, therefore, in the nonverbal ways matter. But why does it matter? What if we communicate poorly nonverbally? What happens to the person we're dialoguing with? Do they get convinced? No, they don't. And so good arguments need good arguers because ultimately our goal is to win the person and not just the argument. Because if we can win the argument from a logical perspective, but we don't win the person, they walk away unchanged, or potentially more entrenched in the worldview that they're holding. And so it's really important that we communicate truths in a compelling and a winsome way, which is what this session is all about, particularly when applied to the topic of abortion. So there are three things that I want to cover then in the time that we have to talk about what our good arguments are and how we argue well. I want to first begin by reflecting on the type of approach that we should have in any encounter we have when discussing abortion, but I would say it works for any controversial topic or where there's a subject of disagreement. So what approach should we have in general? The second thing I want to talk about is how to reach people's minds, just on an intellectual level, what basic argumentation we can use. And the third thing that I want to address is what Blaise and Jonathan were getting at near the end of their presentation, which is how do we reach the heart of people, not just the minds, but the heart as well. So what general approach should we take, how to reach the mind, and how to reach the heart. In terms of the general approach, I love books. And in fact, a mutual friend of Jonathan's and mine just posted this picture on Jonathan's wall. And I think it really captures me, and I'm sensing perhaps all of us in the room. You're all thrilled that you have a new book on your table from Jonathan and Blaise. So I love books, and I love new books. And so I was recently gifted this new book. And I know that you guys in med school are often overwhelmed with reading textbooks, but if you have any spare moment, I highly recommend this book, A More Beautiful Question: The Power of Inquiry to Spark Breakthrough Ideas. It's a fascinating book, and I would say it's a well-written book because as the reader, I was inspired reading it. I made changes to my lifestyle because of it, and that to me is a sign of a well-written book. What's so great about this book is it activates the mind when it comes to the power of questions and how questions are really transformative. One example it gives in the book of the power of questions is the story regarding this man, Van Phillips. Has anyone ever heard of the name Van Phillips? No. Well, I think in a few moments you'll realize that you have at least heard of Van Phillips' invention. So this picture is more recent, but decades ago when Van was around all of your age, he was on the water skiing with friends, and there was a water skiing accident, and one of his legs had to be amputated from just below the knee. And when Van was recovering, he asked himself a question. If they can put a man on the moon, why can't they make a decent foot? Because the artificial limb that he was given was like walking around with a ball and chain. It was shaped like a foot, it felt like a block, and he started to ask more questions than simply, if they can put a man on the moon, why can't they make a better foot? He started to ask himself questions like, why is the artificial foot shaped like a foot? Should it be shaped this way? Or, less than appearance, is it more about performance? And how can a better foot be made? And how can they make a better foot? And then his question changed to, how can I make a better foot? And so he eventually developed the cheetah, which has been used by Oscar Pistorius in the 2012 Olympics. It was used by an amputee to climb Mount Everest, and it's used regularly by Van to do his runs on the beach, all because of a question. Or take this man. He is a winner of the Nobel Prize from the 1940s. He won it in the area of physics. His name is Isidor Isaac Roby, and he won for discovering nuclear magnetic resonance, which is used in MRIs. And he has a great story in which he says, every Jewish mother in Brooklyn would ask her child after school, so, did you learn anything today? Not my mother, he said. Izzy, she would say to me, did you ask a good question today? That difference, he said, asking good questions, made me become a scientist. And asking good questions led to his great discovery. Questions are so important, and that should be what we continually draw on when we're dialoguing with people on controversial subjects. We want to seek to understand, and not just ask any question, but ask good questions. And I'll give you an example of how that relates to the topic of abortion. Several months ago, 2 women who work at a pregnancy care center approached me and asked if I could do some consulting work for them and help them be more effective in their interactions with their clients. And so as we were meeting and discussing, one of the things I was talking about was the importance of questions. And I said to them, you know, there is a question that pro-life people often ask abortion supporters. And it goes like this. What if someone aborted you? How many of you have heard that question be said by someone or have thought it yourself or said it yourself? At the very least, we probably heard other people say it. What if someone aborted you? It's a question, so from that perspective, that's good. But I would say there's a better question that can be asked. And I looked at these 2 counselors and I said, I don't ask people that question. What if someone aborted you? And the reason I don't ask people that question is it doesn't get me to the answer I think the other person needs to get to. You see, the pro-lifer asks the question, what if someone aborted you, in order to make what point? What point is trying to be made with that question? What is the pro-lifer trying to get at? Abortion ends a life, so you would therefore be missing. What's that? Do unto others. Now, the challenge we're faced with, and I have seen over and over, especially as the years go on, is a lot of people's sense of self-worth is about here instead of up here. It's way down. And so when a pro-lifer says, what if someone aborted you? They're coming from the pro-life perspective where they have a good sense of self-worth, that I am made in the image of God. A lot of pro-lifers will think, and my life is valuable, and therefore, gosh, if someone eliminated me from the world, how tragic would that be? So if I think this way, you'll think that way. But if that person's sense of self-worth is not very high, but it's very low, when I say, what if someone aborted you? They may respond back, I wish they had. Or, I wouldn't care, or I wouldn't know. And so the question we ask doesn't get us to the conclusion we want to get that person to. And so I looked at these 2 counselors and I said, but there's a better question that we can ask to achieve the end the original questioner wanted to get to. And so I said, what I often do is I'll say to people, can you think of anyone, and would you be willing to tell me about someone who you really love, romantically or not, maybe just a family member or a close friend, but someone you have a real close connection to, a strong kinship that you care deeply for? Is there anyone? And then the person usually has at least one person, and they'll begin to describe that individual to me. And once they have made that emotional connection in their mind to the individual that they love, I then ask my question. What if someone aborted them? And I get a very different answer, because now they're thinking about my question in the context of someone who they do value, as opposed to being asked that question in the context of themselves, unfortunately, someone they all too often don't value. Now, that's a problem in and of itself that needs to be addressed. But in terms of, at a surface level, if we're just have that dialogue on abortion, we can ask a better question. A couple days later, one of the counselors contacted me and said, Stephanie, you're not going to believe what happened. We had a client come to us, and she said she found out through a pregnancy test that she was pregnant, and she wanted to have an abortion. And so we decided to apply your strategy on her. And so as we were getting to know her, we asked things about her, and we found out that she works at a daycare, and she really loves the children that she gets to care for every single day. And so when we learned that, we said to her, think about those children at the daycare that you delight in looking after. Now, can you imagine if some or all of them weren't there because they were aborted? The conversation and interaction with the client continued. Eventually, the encounter ended. The client contacted them a short while later to say she decided to carry to term. And they said, well, that's fantastic news, and we want to help you through this. Out of curiosity, what influenced you to this conclusion? And she said, I got thinking about those kids in the daycare and that question you asked me and how I really wouldn't want to imagine life without any of them. So we want to ask questions, and we want to ask good questions. Let me give you another example. After giving a presentation where I was talking about the approach of asking questions, an obstetrician approached me afterwards, and he said, it's really true what you say about the power of questions. He said, I had a patient come to me, and she had a history of multiple miscarriages, early as well as late in pregnancy. She had a stillbirth. She had gone through a lot of trauma in losing her children. He said she came to me because she was pregnant again, but this time she wanted an abortion. And he said, in my mind, I was thinking, that doesn't make sense. Like, you have wanted all these children so badly that you lost. I was thinking to myself, he said, why would she want the abortion? And then I started to think, well, maybe it's because she has been through so much trauma as a result of losing these children that she can't fathom carrying through with another pregnancy to a certain point where it will naturally come to an end. And he said, as all of this is going through my mind, I decided I'm just going to ask her a question. And he said, I looked at her and I said, how did those miscarriages, how did that stillbirth, how did those impact you? And he just let her speak. And she talked about the depression, the suicidal ideation, all the sleepless nights and the sad days. And after she had, in a sense, almost relived the memory of that difficulty, he then asked her another question. How do you think having an abortion will impact you? And immediately, he said, it was like a light bulb went off in her mind, and she said, oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way. He didn't have to preach at her. He simply needed to ask a couple good questions. And so to round out this point then, this first point about the approach that we want to take when interacting with other people on this topic is we really want to focus on asking questions and asking good questions. And I would say it's important to supplement the questions we ask with some good analogies or stories that help make the core principle we want to communicate more clear in people's minds. Because analogies take things that we can relate to or understand, that we can visualize, that we already have a conclusion about, and insert within that setting we understand the main principle that we're maybe having a more difficult time accepting. And when that main principle is brought to light through a set of circumstances that we can relate to and understand, it's easier to embrace the conclusion. So we want to ask lots of good questions, and we want to make analogies or tell stories. Which leads me now to the second thing that I wanted to address, which is how to reach the mind. When it comes to reaching the mind, I think a good open-ended question to ask anyone we're debating on abortion is this. What do you think about abortion? So that the first point of contact in the encounter is not you getting on a soapbox and telling the person what you think and all you've learned this weekend even, but instead is more like sitting on a chair next to them and wanting to draw out of them what they think. Now, if you were to ask your average classmate, what do you think about abortion? What are you likely to hear in response? Are you guys used to being lectured to? See, this is the thing. We just expect people to speak to us, but we need to interact. So you ask the average person in your class, hey, position on abortion, for it, against it, or in the middle? Where are the majority going to lie? Where are they going to lie? For or in the middle, but not against, unfortunately. So the vast majority of people in some capacity are going to support abortion. So once we ask, what do you think about abortion? And we get the response, well, I'm for it. I like to follow up with another question and say, okay, in what circumstances are you for abortion? And again, thinking about the average person that you could interact with, if you were to draw out of them the main circumstances under which they would support abortion, what would those be? Save the life of the mother, incest or rape. What other cases might we hear? Pardon me? Just in general, a support of choice. But if we were to look at the specific cases the woman would be in, okay, wow, it's like you read my mind. in course. It interferes with career. Unplanned. Young, age. Maybe she's worried about more violence to herself, violence to the child. And I think career was already mentioned. So this is just a sampling. There are others that could be raised. And so every time someone gives us a circumstance under which they would support abortion, there's something we can agree with them on. And what we can agree with them on is that to be pregnant and poor would be difficult. To be pregnant and very young, or in a situation of domestic violence, would be horrible. To be pregnant from rape seems unimaginable. In each of these cases, we can imagine how difficult it would be to be pregnant and in those circumstances. What we want to do, after acknowledging the difficulty of the circumstance, is we want to ask a question which involves making an analogy to a born child. We want to say, imagine someone isn't pregnant and poor, but they're pregnant and fine financially. But after birth, things get difficult. So difficult that they hit financial hard times and have a difficult time caring for this born child. We ask a question. May anyone kill this newborn child because of the mother's poverty? What are they going to say? No, obviously they're going to respond no. So then we ask another question. Why then may someone kill the preborn child because of poverty? And what are they going to respond back with? It's not a human. Wait a minute. You're comparing apples to oranges. Embryos are not human, infants are. So obviously you cannot kill infants for poverty, but you may kill embryos for reasons of poverty. If that's the response we get out of the individual, that is actually an important step in the right direction in our conversation. What that shows is the person we're dialoguing with does not consider preborn children to be equal to the born. They consider preborn children to be inferior. So it's not that the person we're dialoguing with is bloodthirsty and thinks homicide is a solution to poverty. They don't. They wouldn't kill the born child. Instead, it's that the person we're dialoguing with doesn't think abortion is homicide. They don't think the preborn child is human, at least like that born child is, and therefore they would choose a solution in the case of pregnancy that they wouldn't choose after. Which then leads us to an important point of our conversation, which is to ask the question of when life begins. The born child, they won't kill for reasons of poverty. The born child, they won't kill for the fact that the mom is really young. The born child, they won't kill in a context of domestic violence. When did that born child begin his or her life? Because if we can pinpoint that moment, then wouldn't it logically follow that if it would be wrong to kill the born child in any number of circumstances at the point in this picture, it would be wrong from the point that child began her existence. So we want to get people to a point in our conversation where we're asking the question, when does life begin? And once we've gone through some circumstances and the person has said they won't kill the born child for poverty or rape or disability or domestic violence, but they will permit an abortion in those cases because embryos aren't human. At that point in the conversation, I like to ask another question. It's a topic that Blaise addressed as it relates, though, to euthanasia, and that is about human rights. So when someone is basically coming from the perspective that they don't think the embryo is human, I'll say, just a question to clarify. Out of curiosity, would you say you're someone who believes in human rights? Now, when you ask a classmate that, what are they going to say? Yes, of course I believe in human rights. I've traveled the world and asked people that, and I consistently get the answer, yes, I believe in human rights. So then you can ask a follow-up question, use your phone to get an image. This is a one-celled embryo after sperm-egg fusion, after fertilization, in the one-cell stage. And so when they say they believe in human rights, I would point to this image and say, okay, well, what about this human's rights? Now, when you look and they look at that picture, what are they likely to respond back with? That's not a human. So then we just ask another question. What are her parents? Is the pregnant woman human? Is her partner human? If yes, wouldn't it logically follow that that embryo must be human as well? Now, generally, the person we're dialoguing with, especially if they're a student of science in med school, they're not going to argue you on that technicality, but they might respond back with, well, even if it's human, it's not alive, although they shouldn't say that, but all too often people do. In fact, I was once at the University of Manitoba, and a student that was near a pro-life exhibit that I was exhibiting came past, and so I approached him and I said, what do you think about abortion? And he said, I'm pro-choice. And I said, well, why are you pro-choice? And he said, well, the fetus isn't alive. And I just asked a question. I said, well, if the fetus isn't alive, why do you need to do an abortion? And he just paused, and he stared at me, and then broke silence after about 5 or 10 seconds and said, you're good. And then, not wanting to concede, he was entirely convinced, he said, I'm going to talk to you. Most people I wouldn't even engage, but you're smart enough, I'll talk to you. So I passed the test of this philosophy student, and so we had a very interesting conversation. But the point is, it was a question that was a good question that addressed his objection that the embryo wasn't alive. Or another question we can ask, if we get the objection, the embryo, even if of the species Homo sapiens, even if technically human isn't alive, is to simply ask, is the embryo growing? And we know from the 1 cell to the 2 and 4 and 8 that the embryo is growing, so by virtue of growth, the embryo ought to be considered living. By virtue of having human parents, the embryo ought to be considered human. And if we believe in human rights, then that living human ought to have the same rights as you or me. At that point, they may drop the F-bomb, and it's not the one you're thinking, but the one that relates to this. So they may say, well, it's just a fetus. Now, what's the classic pro-life response when someone says it's just a fetus? Any ideas? Right. Pro-lifers often say, well, fetus is just a Latin term for young one. And they could ask it as a question, well, what does fetus mean? That would be a better answer, but a better question. But I think an even better question would be to ask, well, what kind of fetus? And they might be confused, like, why are you even asking that? What are you talking about? What kind of fetus? So then, use your phone, drop an image. And, I think you've got National Geographic in the womb animals. And so this is a dolphin fetus. And you make the point that other species have fetuses. That, as we know, the word fetus is not species specific. Dolphins have it, dogs have it, and humans have it. And the word fetus doesn't tell us what you are. It tells us how old you are, what age range you're in. What I like to, again, in dialogue do in order to be asking lots of questions, getting the other party being the one not only engaged through their thinking, but owning the point by verbalizing it, is I will ask the question, when the human fetus is born and in the mom's arms, what do we call the fetus? They say baby. And I say, when the baby turns 2, what do we call the baby at that point? They say toddler, and I say when the toddler turns 13, what do we call the toddler? Depending on who you're talking to, they may say teenager, although one person I spoke with said impossible. That's what we would call them. So then when impossible turns 21, what do we call impossible? More impossible. So the point is that The word embryo or the word fetus is like the word infant, toddler, teenager, adult. These tell us how old something is or what age range they're in, but not what something is. If we want to know what something is, we simply ask, what are the parents? The reality is there isn't that much that can be said in defense of abortion when it comes to the argument from abortion supporters that the embryo isn't a living human. That can be refuted very easily with the basic questioning that I've given you. Another question I like to ask is this. Imagine we're not talking about wanting to end life. Imagine we're talking about wanting to make life. Imagine someone is struggling with infertility and they go to an IVF specialist to try to get pregnant. Now, setting aside the ethics of IVF, what is the one moment the IVF specialist is trying to achieve in the lab? The moment of fertilization. They're not trying to suddenly create an 8-month fetus. They're not trying to create a 5-year-old in an instant. They're not happy with just a sperm sample. They're not happy with some eggs harvested from college students paid in the US $20,000 for every extraction. They're satisfied when they have sperm-egg fusion and a genetically distinct individual is there. When it comes to making life, we say we know exactly when it begins. So the question is, why, when we want to end life, do we claim there's a debate about when life begins, or that it doesn't begin at the moment of conception? What I find is more often the topic of discussion is less a scientific question and more a philosophical one, where people we're dialoguing with will say, even if the embryo is genetically human and genetically and is alive, the embryo is not a person. What would be a good question to ask back if someone were to make that point? What is a person? Let's seek to understand what their definition is. If you were to ask a classmate how they would define a person, what are you likely to hear as the definition or the criteria? A person is someone who is sentient, has a personality, makes choices, they're thinking, they're reasoning. And they would say the embryo, especially at the one-celled stage, is not thinking or reasoning, is not sentient, is not rational. That's why the embryo isn't a person. So we want to step back and ask another question. And we want to ask why, in the case of the human embryo, that embryo is not thinking or reasoning or sentient, aware of themselves. What do we need to do any of those things? A brain. And why doesn't the embryo have a brain at fertilization? Too early, because the embryo hasn't developed the brain, and brain is reflected in the past, a brain. And the embryo hasn't developed the brain, which happens with the passage of time. So the embryo, yes, cannot think or reason, be sentient or rational, any of this stuff, ultimately because the embryo hasn't developed the brain, and the embryo hasn't developed the brain because the embryo hasn't had the time to develop the brain. And time is reflected in our age. The embryo can't act on the human abilities to think and reason and be sentient, ultimately because of how old the embryo is. So then we ask the question, should personhood be grounded in being human or in being a certain age? Should personhood be grounded in being human or in being a certain age? And you know what? Someone has already answered that question. The United Nations. Now, when I mention the United Nations, do you think, wow, they really oppose abortion? Or do you think they very much support abortion? We think support abortion, and they have a number of conferences and documents in which they lay that out. But I would say that at a foundational level, when you look at their basic documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the Declaration on the Rights of the Child, or the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, we'll actually see the United Nations, based on those documents, is profoundly anti-abortion. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says all members of the human family have the right to life. Through our questioning, have we established that the embryo is a member of the human family? Yes. So then it would logically follow that according to the UN, the human embryo has the right to life. Then in Article 6 of that same document, it references the concept of personhood. And it says everyone has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. So we want to ask a question. Who's everyone? Well, we go back up to the preamble and we see everyone is all members of the human family. So they're essentially saying if you're a member of the human family, you ought to automatically be considered a person before the law. In the UN's Declaration on the Rights of the Child, they say the child, by reason of his or her physical and mental immaturity, has rights to special safeguards and care before as well as after birth, end quote. So their Declaration on the Rights of the Child is emphasizing the rights of preborn children because of their vulnerability. So whereas abortion supporters will often say, well, because they're totally dependent on the mom, because they're immature, because they haven't developed their brains, abortion is justified. On the contrary, the UN is making the point the vulnerability and the immaturity of the child is what heightens our responsibility towards the child and gives the child special protection. Or take the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In this document, the UN speaks to countries where the death penalty is legal. And in this document it says, in countries where the death penalty is legal, it may never be done on a pregnant woman. What would be a good question to ask? Why? Or why not? What makes a pregnant woman who has committed a crime in her country that would normally result in the death penalty different from a non-pregnant woman who's committed a crime that in her country would result in the death penalty? Both are guilty, but in the body of one is an innocent person. And whether we agree or disagree about how to treat guilty people, both sides of the death penalty debate agree about how we should treat innocent people. And no one wants innocent people getting the death penalty, which is why a guilty pregnant woman is not getting the death penalty, because in her body is an innocent child. But then what do we do if someone makes not a personhood argument, not a scientific refuting the science type argument, but instead make a bodily rights argument? When Rebecca was at the University of Ottawa, she organized a debate on abortion that I did against a philosophy professor by the name of Dr. Snedden. And in his presentation, he got up and he said, I'm going to concede for the sake of discussion that the embryo is a moral person just like you or me. But I'm going to still argue that abortion is justified, and here's how. He said, I want you to imagine that you're a parent of a born child, and you love your child has a kidney disease that means he's going to die unless he gets a kidney transplant. Now imagine you're the only person in the entire world with the right body type to be able to give one of your kidneys to your child and save your child's life. Would it be nice of you, he said, to donate one of your kidneys to your child? Yes. Would it kill you, he asked, to donate one of your kidneys to your child? No. Will it save your child to donate one of your kidneys to your child? Yes, he said. But should the law force you as a parent to give one of your kidneys to your child? No, he said, it should not. Just as the child is a human person but doesn't have a right to your kidney, so too one could argue that the embryo is a human person but doesn't have a right to the mother's uterus. What do? We ask a question. And so I got up and I said, Dr. Snedden makes a very compelling argument until we ask a question. And the question we have to ask is this: what is the nature and purpose of the kidney versus the nature and purpose of the uterus? Because the answer to that question will explain why a parent is not legally obligated to give one, but ought to be legally obligated to give the other. I said, the kidney exists in my body, for my body. But the uterus is very different. I said, the uterus exists in my body every single month, getting ready for someone else's body. It's an organ unique from all the others in that it exists more for the offspring than for me. While it benefits me, it nonetheless exists more for the offspring in a way that we cannot claim my kidneys exist for my offspring. They, in fact, primarily exist for me. And so, therefore, we can claim the preborn child has a right to the uterus in a way a born child doesn't have a right to the kidney. Because at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, do parents have a basic duty to meet the needs of their children? Not their extraordinary needs, but their ordinary care. And we know the answer is yes. Parents are obligated to feed, clothe, and shelter their children. Pregnancy is analogous, you could say, to feeding, clothing, and sheltering one's child. It's the basic care required by a parent for the offspring at that stage in their development. When it comes to dialoguing with people on abortion, I think it's also helpful to use facts about abortion and bring those into the conversation and ask questions about them. So for example, even just using the statistic of how often abortions happen, 100,000 times a year in Canada. A lot of people who support abortion don't realize how often it happens. So to first ask them, how often does abortion happen? If they don't know, inform them it's 100,000 times a year. Some stats that you'll look at may show a lower figure, but if you read the fine print, it's because several clinics in major provinces, such as British Columbia and Ontario, aren't always reporting their statistics. So when the lack of reporting is counted in, the estimate is 100,000 abortions. So to ask the question, how do you feel about that number? A lot of times people are uncomfortable with that frequency. Or you can cite what I saw in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology of Canada in 2012. They had a journal article in which they said that 1/3 of all abortions occur on women who have previously had at least one abortion. So you ask the question, how do you feel about repeat abortions? How do you feel about abortion being used as a form of birth control? And even abortion supporters get uncomfortable with that. But then we want to ask why. If there's nothing wrong with one abortion, why would there be something wrong with two? But if there is something wrong with two abortions, perhaps what makes two wrong is the very same reason for why one is wrong. And so we use those facts to ask questions. Or you can look at the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario have a document called Induced Abortion Guidelines, and in it they say D&E, so dilation and evacuation, where basically the baby is removed part by part, piece by piece. The abortionist just blindly clamps down whatever they feel, yank out, there's an arm, clamp, pull out, there's a leg, and continuing to do this. And in D&E abortions, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario says beyond 13 weeks, foot length must be measured. So you can take that fact and ask a question. Whose foot? And if we're talking about a foot, then aren't we talking about a human? Or you can take the point that I raised a few years ago when I debated Dr. Fraser Fellows, a late-term abortionist here in Southern Ontario. He does abortions in London. And when I debated him, I cited a reference from the Induced Abortion Guidelines from the Obstetrician and Gynecologists of Canada. And in that document, it says, fetal tissue should not be removed forcibly through the cervix, as bone spicules may lacerate the cervix. Crushing and rotating techniques lessen cervical trauma. So again, to take that point and ask the question, bone spicules from who? Crush and rotate what? Ask questions to draw out of the other person an opportunity to verbalize the facts that we're actually talking about a human being. There's power to that, and yet it can only go so far, which brings me to my third and final point, which is how to reach the heart when we have a difficult time getting to the head. I once spoke at another campus here in Ontario, And at the end of my presentation, a girl came up during Q&A and asked about rape. And my common response when asked about rape is to, at the beginning, express sympathy for any victims of sexual assault, to acknowledge that an injustice has occurred, and then to simply ask the question, is it fair to give the death penalty to the innocent child? In the case of this girl, when I gave my short answer, she wasn't satisfied. So I thought, well, I can give her a better answer. So then I said, imagine for a moment someone has consensual sex with her husband on Monday, and then on Tuesday, as she's walking home from work late at night, she's raped by a stranger. So that in a month's time, when she finds out she's pregnant, she won't know whether the father of her child is the husband or the rapist. So I said to this girl, imagine the woman carries on with her pregnancy, hoping it's her husband's child. And then after birth, they do a paternity test and discover the child's father is not her husband, it's the rapist. I asked this student a question. Would we allow anyone to kill the newborn child because of the father's crime? Once again, she resisted my point. She said, yeah, but that would never happen. That's made up. So then I thought, oh, I've got more. So then I said, well, actually, there was an article in the New York Times a few years ago interviewing an abortionist who still does abortions, Dr. Wickland. And in this article, it said Dr. Wickland described her horror when she aborted the pregnancy of a woman who had been raped, only to discover after examining the removed tissue, where they have to make sure they got all the parts out so there's no infection. As she was going through the removed tissue, she realized the pregnancy was further along than she or the woman had thought, and that she had just aborted an embryo the woman and her husband had conceived together. Even the abortionist was horrified. So if it's horrifying to kill a child conceived in love, shouldn't it also be horrifying to kill a child conceived in violence if the reason why it's horrifying is that children have a right to life, regardless of the circumstances under which they were conceived? Nothing getting through to her. Even that didn't do it. So I finally had to say, I would love to keep speaking with you, but in fairness to the long line of students behind you, I'll have to ask that you let them ask their questions and just suggest that you come speak to me one-on-one at the end, and I'd be happy to speak with you later. So after all the other students ask their question, the event ends, boom, she's up at the podium. She wants to speak one-on-one. And she is focused like a laser beam on the circumstance of pregnancy and from rape and abortion being needed. And I started to wonder, could I be speaking with a victim of sexual assault? Is it possible I'm not getting through to her up here because the problem's down here? And so at one point in the conversation, I said, I have several friends who have been molested as children. I said, one friend who's disclosed this to me has never even told her parents. And as a result of a difficult time she went through with memories and telling me, I said, look, I can only help you so much because I'm a friend and you need a counselor, but I'm willing to go with you to counseling. And so I went with her to counseling to try to get her help. And I said to this girl, I'll be honest with you, I'll be upfront. My friend never got pregnant because she was too young. I said, but as I journeyed with her to get healing, what I realized is whether someone gets pregnant or not from sexual assault, they've been traumatized. And an abortion's not going to take that trauma away. And she looked at me and she said, yeah, 10 years and counting. And I just looked at her. I said, I am so sorry for your suffering. And in that moment, everything about our conversation changed. My questions went from maybe kill an innocent child because of the father's crime to questions of how are you doing? Is the person who hurt you still in your life? Do you feel you've had adequate counseling and help, or could I help connect you to a place that can continue to journey with you through this horrible thing that you've experienced? And as I shifted from the head to the heart and met her where she was at, I saw her transform before my eyes. Where she'd been hostile and frustrated earlier on, she was calm, she was pensive. A bridge felt like had been built between us. And I was reminded of what my friends over at Justice for All have said. When someone asks about rape, they're not asking if the baby is human. They're asking if the pro-lifer is human. Do we care as much for the person in front of us as we care for the child in the womb? Imagine I had 3 buckets of water in front of me. One had cold water in it, one had lukewarm water in it, and one had hot water in it. Imagine I put my left hand in the cold water and my right hand in the hot water. And after a minute, I take them both out and put them in the middle bucket. The hand which came from the hot water is going to think the new bucket of water is what? Cold. The hand which came from the cold water is going to think the new bucket of water is hot. Both of them are actually wrong because technically, objectively, the temperature in the new bucket is lukewarm. But the previous experience is coloring the present interpretation. Just last month, I was at Purdue University, and as I was debating with a student on abortion, I asked him what he thought. And he said, even like physically gestured, hands back, hands off. I can't tell a woman what to do. I refuse to control. I refuse to dominate. No way. And so I started to engage him on that, and he was like this girl on the topic of rape was focused like a laser beam. He was focused obsessively on control and domination. And the reason the bucket of water thought experiment is so helpful to why I raised that is because in moments like that, we want to ask ourselves, what temperature was the bucket before I met them? Where are they coming from? What's their life experience? And so as this one guy and I were talking, at one point in the conversation, the topic of rape came up, and I mentioned several friends of mine who were victims of sexual assault. And then he said, yeah, me too. I've been sodomized. Why was he obsessed with control and domination? Because he'd been a victim of control and domination as a young child. So as we're dialoguing with people, we want to have the wisdom and sensitivity to know when to meet people at an intellectual level and when to more reach their hearts and say, what's your story? Or where does your passion come from? What does someone who thinks like me need to know from someone who thinks like you? When did you first learn about abortion, and what was your view then? When did it change, and why? It's those types of questions that are going to bring out of people the stories that have influenced where they are today, because they're the stories about where they came from. And if we can have enough insight by applying the approach of asking questions and asking good questions to our encounters to know when to ask questions that reach the head and when to ask questions that reach the heart, then I think we will succeed in not only winning an argument, but in winning the person as well.